All right, welcome back. This is Peter Cole, and this is going to be part 8 of my Intro to Orchestral Sample Library series. This is a series I'm doing for beginners. If you're first getting started out using your orchestral sample libraries in your DAW and you're trying to make it sound a little more realistic and learn some tips and tricks of the trade, that's what these videos are about. In my previous video, which was part 7, and by the way, I encourage you to watch that video first, as well as the other videos in this series, because in this video, which is part 8, it's a continuation of that one we just did on reverb. And in that video, we talked about just the kind of the basics of reverb, what reverb is, the different types of digital reverb that we often encounter in our DAWs, those being convolution reverb and algorithmic reverb. And the main kind of takeaway from the previous video on reverb was using reverb to place our orchestra inside of a space, inside of a room. That's kind of the whole gist of the last video, and is a big part of the purpose of reverb, is to create a sense of space for our music to be performed inside of. And by the way, it doesn't always apply just to orchestral music, of course. It can apply to any kind of music, rock music, jazz, pop, anything. The idea of reverb is really to place your music inside of a space so the listener gets a sense of it happening somewhere. So in this video, we're continuing that concept, but we're going to be digging into a little more advanced ideas around reverb and kind of how it applies to mixing orchestral music. And specifically, the main takeaway from today's discussion is similarly the idea of placing your orchestra inside of a space, but now we're also going to be concerned with some really cool stuff, I find really cool anyway. That is kind of the depth of the space. So it's this idea of, yes, it's a room, right? We have a room and we have a left side of the room and we have a right side of the room, but we also have different layers of depth within that room, right? Depending on how close or far you are to the instruments. So it's pretty cool. Some of it's a little advanced and some of it's a little hard to hear a lot of the nuances, especially if you don't have headphones on or really good speakers. You might not hear all the nuances that we're talking about. But the idea here is, again, that idea of creating some depth, and I refer to it as a 3D space for my music. All right, so as I was saying, we're concerned in this discussion about this idea of a room having volume, right? Having not just a left and a right channel, which is what we're used to when we open up our DAWs and our mixers. Over the years, we've all been used to working with the left and the right, right? You know, our pan knob, we all got a pan knob that goes left to bring up the left side and right for the right side. We all know how those work. But of course, in a real room, and if you go to a symphony hall and you're sitting there, it's not just the left and the right that we're hearing music from. It's also the front of the symphony and the back of the symphony. And that's what creates those layers, that depth, because the things that are closer to you are going to be louder. They're right, because they're closer to you. They're also going to have different character. So they might be a little crisper because they're closer to your ears, right? You can hear them. Whereas the things in the back are further away. So technically they will probably be a little quieter, but there's also a different character because they are further away from you. They're not going to be as full sounding, and we'll talk more about that as we dive in. So that's the thing I want you to keep in mind. And that's the kind of the plane we're talking about in this discussion. It's more about depth, and it's more about a front to back experience, not just left and right. And I spent a lot of time studying and working in like 3D and 3D graphics. And in that world, I learned this term called the Z-axis. So you might be familiar with X and Y. So X is the horizontal from left to right axis, and Y is the up and down, right, vertical. And then there's this Z-axis, which is effectively the front to back. So in a 3D space, we have all those. We have up and down, we have left and right, and then the really kind of cool one we're talking about today is that Z axis. We're going to jump into the DAW, but first I'm going to bring up a diagram of an orchestra because I think it might help to make this a little more clear. So you might have seen this before. It's a pretty common layout of an orchestra. This is a common layout, and the orchestras have been around literally for centuries. Isn't that crazy? Like centuries orchestras have been around, and they've changed their format a little bit, but this is a very common one of and for the purposes of what we're doing today and kind of learning this stuff, it doesn't really matter if it changes a little bit. The idea here is we're looking at all the instruments in the orchestra, and we're looking at them, how they sit on the stage. So we know where that conductor is. You've probably seen an orchestra before, right? You know the conductor's right in the middle, and his or her back faces the audience, and they're facing the orchestra, of course, right? So they're in the very, very front, and to the conductor's left is the first violins. To the conductor's right are the cellos, and then we got the double basses on the far right. So interesting how they chose to lay that out, right? Then as we move back in the space, so now we're talking about 3D space now. We're talking about the Z plane. We're going back in the room. The second violins are behind the first violins. Then we dig into or I should say the violas are right in front of the conductor, but still a little bit further away than the first violins. Because remember, the audience is down here in the front. So that's kind of the perspective. We're always coming from the perspective of the audience. Where are these instruments sitting relative to the audience? And then we're not going to go through every single one here, but you can see that as the orchestra fills out, we have different layers, different depths of that room. Flutes and oboes, all the woodwinds come next. And then we got the brass in the back. And then in the very way back is the percussion. And it's interesting that the percussion is sort of centered, right? They're on the top and they're sort of centered along the top and around the side. Just on a slight tangent, one discussion that comes up a lot when mixing modern orchestra music is if you notice, those double basses are all the way on the far, far right. And of course, we get trained a lot when we're producing music that the bass should be right in the center. So this is always a big, I'm not going to get too much into it right now, but this is always an interesting discussion point. It's like, do we leave the basses on the far right? Isn't that kind of weird? So when we dig into more, maybe more hybrid or more modern orchestral music, often that bass, if it remains as an orchestral instrument, sometimes it'll get panned to the center to kind of lock in that center channel of the bass. But for purposes of this discussion, we're really concerned about a more traditional orchestral sound because we're trying to recreate a natural, realistic sound. That's kind of the purpose of all this. So I bring that up just so you're aware of it. But really what we're trying to do here is just make a more realistic sounding orchestra and being aware of the depth and the position of each instrument within the room. The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of the reason why it's laid out this way is also because of the loudness of each individual instrument. So percussion tends to be the loudest darn thing in the room, right? The percussion is loud. Not always, right? Because you can play a drum soft, but when the drums get going and they're loud, they overpower everything. So you can imagine the orchestra folks centuries ago when they were coming up with this, they probably put the drummers in the back so they wouldn't overpower everything, right? Because they didn't have microphones back then. It had to sound natural in a room with no technology to help turn things up and down. Really cool and interesting. So, and then we move up and the darn brass there right in front of them, they're really loud, right? Of the tonal instruments, they are the loudest. So it kind of makes sense that you got the two loudest fellas in the back there. And then the more, as you move up, certainly the woodwinds are generally the softest of the group, and they're right there in the center. And then we got our stringed instruments, which are usually the most used and most prominent of the orchestra, are right there in front. So their presence is right there close to the audience. Interesting. Anyway, I wanted you to see this diagram because now we're going to step into the DAW, and I'll be referring back to this a lot, so we'll be bringing it back. But I want to open up a Spitfire library, and again, you don't have to use Spitfire libraries for any of this stuff. The reason why I'm bringing it up, though, is Spitfire has this really cool microphone mixer. It's basically a way of turning up and down the mics that are close to the audience and far away from the audience, right? So if it's right in the middle, watch how the audience... So, by the way, I think this is obvious, but in case I went too fast, you can probably already see the similarities between this diagram here and what Spitfire has laid out in their microphone mixer, right? Very similar. In fact, it's like the black and white version. So that's what this represents. This represents the orchestra. And as I move this slider up, what I'm doing is I'm moving the audience closer to the orchestra. So I'm hearing more of the raw instrument, less of the room, right? Because there's less opportunity for me to hear the room if I'm sitting closer to the instruments. Whereas if I go back to the far position, now I'm moving the audience way back there. And now I'm going to be hearing not only the orchestra, but I'm hearing way more of the room. So more reverb, more sound of the room, less closeness. So this is a great tool, and it really illustrates ultimately what we're talking about here. The big difference, or the big thing I want to call out, is that in here we're listening to an ensemble patch. So I'll Be in One is a library that provides its instruments as ensembles. So that's, in this case, this is the string section we're looking at. So all the strings are together. And frankly, for this discussion, that's perfect because we can have all of our strings kind of in the same depth of space. And then as we move on to the other instruments, we can push them back in the room. But I bring that up because if we would have another opportunity to look at what the depth is for the woodwinds and the brass and the percussion, and we'll look at that in a minute. Okay, so I'm in I'll Be in One, and let's just do a real quick example of how this sounds to basically be in an orchestra, in a symphony hall, and be the audience, and either be really close to the orchestra or far from the orchestra, and hear how it sounds. So here's way up close. See how much you're hearing that pure sound of those strings, and you're not hearing a lot of the room. And in this case, because it's a Spitfire library and they record a lot of their samples inside of Air Studios in London, that's the room you would be hearing once we start going further away. See how the room comes in? Now you're hearing more of Air Studios, not just the strings. You get all the way to the end, and you can see in the diagram here that the audience is quite a bit away from the orchestra. And when you do that, just the sound changes because you're further away, you're hearing more of that room. And by the way, I have separate videos on the differences of the wet and dry libraries and the impact of the room and just reverb overall, including the previous video in this discussion. So I will link to those in the description of this one, because I don't want to repeat too much of what we already covered. But you can see now what's happening. Now I'm going to get back to the center, and then I'm going to go close again so you can hear it. Big difference, right? This is what we would call dry. So this is a dry signal. It's got none of the reverb. And then this is super wet. Do you hear how... What I really want you to listen for is that it's the detail and the crispness of the sound changes. There's a lot. It sounds very big and lush, of course, like this. But listen to how much more detail you're hearing when you get close up. right? Because you're literally sitting closer to the instrument, so you're hearing it. It's much closer to you. If you step away, it's not just the reverb that's creating this lushness, is what I'm getting at. It's not just the reverb tail that's different. It's the actual attack and crispness and detail of the string itself changes because you're further away. And we're going to talk more about that in a second because that's a key distinction. But having said that, right, the character of the sound actually changes from being up close and further away. So what is key here is that it's not just the reverb. I know this, we've been talking about reverb a lot, and that's a big part of this discussion, but to really make an orchestra sound, a sampled orchestra sound more realistic, it's not just being aware of adding reverb to something, because their actual character of the instruments changes a bit, right? There's a little less attack when you get further away and less detail than when you're super up close. And you can use these tools on purpose when you're trying to bring something to the forefront. So if we imagine again that 3D plane we keep talking about, right? The y-axis, sorry, the z-axis. We're moving closer to the front or further when we're going back. So when we get closer to the front, we get more detail. It's more full sound, less of the room, less of the reverb sound. And as we get back in the room, we get less detail, less crispness, less attack sound to me, and more of the room sound, right? So that's the magic right there. When you're trying to create depth, that's the first place you start. Things in the front, more detail, more attack, more crisp, less reverb, less of the room sound, because they're prominent, they're up front. The more you go back in the room, we get less detail of that specific instrument, and we get more of the room sound. Now we're going to do an example where I am going to mix a couple different libraries, and we're going to kind of place inside the room. We're going to place the strings, and then we're going to put some brass in, and so we're going to make them go a little bit further back, and then we're going to throw some percussion there in the way back of the room. So if I bring up my trusty diagram, I'm going to use Albion 1 for my strings and open up my brass library, and I'm using Cinebrass here, one of my favorites. And I'm going to turn on the close mic, see, close mic, and I'm going to turn off the full mix. And then for the percussion, I'm using the Rhapsody drums. This is just a very simple snare drum that I'm kind of adding in a couple toms, just to give you a little sense of depth. So, but first, let's listen. Let's bring each one in individually. So let's just listen to the strings. Again, this is not some world-class production I put together here, just mostly to give you an idea. I'm going to add the brass. And this is completely dry, right? There's no reverb yet, no EQ. Just very simple, kind of boring, but you get the idea. And then percussion. So off the bat, let's just look at our meters here, and we're not going to get too much into template balancing. That's for the next video. That's a whole other discussion. But you can tell right away that the strings are the softest, right? Just by the levels. See, the percussion is really overpowering it. So that's again what we're talking about here. And this is what's tricky. These sample libraries are in a really challenging spot when you think about it, because they want to record each of their samples the best they possibly can. Because if you were to go and buy and just listen to examples of their samples, you would hear it often out of context of the music. And if the samples sound too quiet, or too thin, or just don't sound as rich as they possibly could, you won't buy it, right? So they have to make the samples sound by themselves sound fantastic. But then you take them and you place them into the context of a mix with other instruments. And it's not that they sound bad, but it starts to lose some of the realism. And as we're seeing here, that little snare drum is blowing everything else away. And it's, you know, it's because it was recorded really well, and the mics are great, and we're way up there close to the mic, right? So it's got that really crisp detail. Now our job is to go in, just like I've been saying, and create some depth. And we want to push the drums back in the room. So we want to push them back, right? And same with the brass. We want to push the brass a little further back. And we want the strings to come up front so we hear more of the strings. So we do that with volume, of course, but we also do that with reverb and with EQ. Because again, what I was saying, the character of the sound changes the closer you are or the further away you are. The closest you are, the character is the most full and most detail and most kind of bold, right? The further you get back in the room, the further away something is, it starts to lose some of that clarity. The best way to describe that is imagine sitting in a room with a horn player and you're, you know, a couple feet away from them. When they play a note, that thing is going to sound loud, but it's going to sound full because you're only a couple feet away. It's going to sound as full as it possibly can. Imagine the microphone that recorded that sample being right up there. It's going to sound as full and crisp as it possibly can because you're not getting any room sound at that point. Now take that same horn and put them 50 feet back in a symphony hall, playing the same note at the same volume, you know, with the same effort. And immediately, not only are you hearing the sound of the room, which is adding a lot of reverb and kind of blurring the sound a bit, but the character of that horn changes as well because you're not getting the same detail. You're probably losing some body as well because it's just physically it's further away. So the body of the instrument starts to thin out and the detail, the crispness starts to go away. So that's where EQ comes in. So I'm going to bring up FabFilter's Pro Q3 equalizer, but of course you can use any similar EQ, including the one that comes for free out of your DAW. In fact, the one Logic comes with I use all the time as well. It's fantastic. Look at this. It's got very similar, very, very similar. So I'm just a little more familiar with the FabFilter one at this point. So I'm going to use that one, but you can use any one you want. It's not, it doesn't matter. So right now, it's basically hardly even being used. I'm just going to clear up these points for a second, and let's just listen. So listen to the brass. First, I'm going to start pushing it back in the room using EQ, right? So this is kind of a wild concept here. But I'm going to start pushing it back in the room. And what I start with usually is the low end, and I like to clear up the low end anyway. But what I'm getting at here is I want to take some of the body away on purpose, which at first could sound kind of counterintuitive to great mixing, right? Like, why would you want to do that? Well, again, we're trying to recreate what it would sound like to have a brass section sitting 50 feet away from the orchestra, not 5 feet away, because that's not where they sit in an orchestra, right? We looked at the diagram, not to keep bringing it up, but here's the brass. They are almost the furthest away next to the percussion. They are way back there. So they're going to have less body than they would if they were sitting up close. So we want to drop some of the low end down. So now it starts to thin out the brass sound. It's not as big and bottom endy, but the real change comes in the high end. Now, you got to be careful here. I'm doing this, I'm exaggerating the heck out of this. Probably wouldn't do it to this extreme because we still want it to sound good. But hopefully you can hear. I'll turn it on and off. So without the EQ, that brass is so much more crisp and detailed and bold, right? As soon as I turn the EQ on, by cutting those high frequencies and the low, you're starting to move the brass further back in the room. Again, you want to do it within reason. I'm kind of exaggerating in some spots here for effect, so you hear it. But that's the general idea. You want to move it back in the room. Then let's throw on the reverb next. So for reverb, you can see that I'm routing my brass section to a separate brass reverb. So you could use the same reverb, but I like to have different reverbs for different instruments. And in this case, I'm using Quantum Leap Spaces. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we covered this in the last video, but just so you get an idea, I'm using an actual, this is a convolution reverb. So, and again, we covered this in the last video, but the convolution reverb is an actual blueprint of a room, right? So this is what a reverb would sound if a brass instrument was playing inside the room. And they also give you these really cool, there's the F, if you look in the presets here, there's FR and RR. That's FR is for front of the room, RR is for back of the room. So I picked a rear of the room. RR is rear of the room. So I'm picking rear of the room because the brass is towards the rear of the room. So I picked that. Really important that you don't want any dry signal because we're using an aux channel, right? Hopefully you've done a similar approach before with different instruments, right? Where you're sending the brass out to an aux channel. In this case, it's the brass reverb. And so this is really important. You don't want to send any of that dry signal, and you want it to be all wet because now you're going to then control the reverb you're adding to your original brass sound. You don't want to include even more of the original sound, then you'll be adding more original sound and you won't hear as much reverb. So you want it to be totally dry and totally wet on the aux. That's different, very different than if you place the reverb directly on the channel, right? Then you need to play with these because you're having one channel and you're blending the two. But generally, the best approach, and I've covered this in other videos, is to send each out to a separate aux channel and then control the reverb that way. So now I've got 100% wet reverb, and then I use my aux send to control how much reverb I'm sending to it. So let's hear. So now we're hearing a really nice reverb coming from Quantum Leap Spaces, but we also have the EQ in there kind of muffling it back and pushing it back in the room. Like watch when I open this up. Really hear it there. I mean, unfortunately this song I picked might be a little not dynamic enough, but when you've got big brass, let me crank up the velocity. So what I've done here, just for demonstration purposes, this is dry again. So let's listen to how it sounds dry. And now I'm going to turn the EQ on. And now I'm going to turn up the reverb. Obviously, the reverb is the most effective. I mean, you can't miss it. That makes the most difference. But that added use of the EQ to just kind of tone down the high end and cut the low end beef starts to help. It sounds crazy, but it kind of minimizes the sound of the brass, which if you have a straight, big, bold, epic brass piece, you don't want to do that necessarily, right? But again, we're talking about recreating a more traditional sounding orchestra, and in this case, that brass is pushed back in the room, so we want it to tame down tame down with EQ the high and the low end. I'm going to turn the strings back on. What is really great already is that I haven't touched the fader knob, right? And already we're getting a more balanced mix. It's probably still not good enough. I would probably bring the brass down a little with the fader, but I don't have to do it as much. You can hear that they're a little more realistic now. You got the strings and the brass kind of matching. Now we'll do the same for the percussion. So right now you're hearing that, and those snare drums sound like they're sitting like a foot away, right? There's no way in any orchestra would it sound like that. Never. This is the most like obvious sign of a unrealistic sounding orchestra is those drums. That's the first thing you can hear, because they always sound way in the back. So let's look at the reverb I use. Again, I'm using Quantum Leap's spaces, and I've got orchestral percussion, rear of room, and again I've got dry signal at 0 and the wet signal at full. So we're getting pure reverb when I send out of my send here. And then I also have the EQ on, and same thing. I'm going to start cutting the low end and cutting the high end, because we want the snare to get pushed back. So let's listen to first just the EQ. So we want to reduce body, because this thing is like 60 feet away from us. And we definitely want to reduce the detail at the high end, the air. You want to lower that air and crispness. So already you can hear that it's pushing back. Obviously, we don't have the reverb on yet, so nowhere near as effective. And it kind of doesn't sound great. You know, you've probably heard the term never, when you're doing mixing, you should never press the solo button, because you always want to hear each instrument in context of everything else. Sometimes it will sound like crap by itself, but it doesn't matter if it sounds right within context of everything else. Same idea here. Sometimes it's going to sound like crap, but the most important thing is that it sounds good with everything else. And in the case of a snare drum, we need to push this sucker back. So now we'll turn on the reverb. So that's maybe a little much. But we've already pushed it back now. Personally, I would even cut off more of the high. So let's hear how that sounds. See, it's most noticeable with the snare. See how much more crisp it is? That sounds great. And I'm not suggesting you cut the heck out of the high end by any means. You want it to sound good, but just be aware that the more detail, the more you're moving it closer to the front of the stage, which is not the way it would sound necessarily in most symphony setups, right? So push it back. And again, we're not touching the faders. I haven't touched a fader at all. I'm just using EQ and reverb to control the volume. And that's what you want to do. That's what you want to, I mean, you end up doing both, but you want to try to use the reverb where you can, because that's actually changing the texture and character of the sound, which is more what we're trying to do here to make it sound more realistic. Volume, again, think about an orchestra, 100 years ago, they didn't have volume knobs. They didn't have faders. They had to make it sound the way they made it sound on how they placed themselves in the hall itself. That's what made all the difference. So we're trying to introduce concepts here to recreate that. And it might not always sound great by itself, but it sounds good within context. So let's listen again to everything. So if we look back at our diagram, I didn't use woodwinds here, I just used strings. We have our strings up front. We have our brass in the back here, and so they've been kind of toned down and pushed in the back. And then in the very back, we got our percussion, which I've kind of pushed pretty far back in this example. Watch when I turn the reverb off, by the way. Listen to those drums. They're immediately way up front, but they just don't sound realistic. It doesn't sound like an orchestra. It sounds like a really well-produced snare drum, which, of course, that's what I'm saying. The sample libraries have to create a well-produced snare drum, because you wouldn't buy it otherwise. If it sounded all EQ'd and thin, you wouldn't buy it. So they give it to you sounding great by itself, but then you go in and through EQ, you push it back, thin it out, and again, I'm probably overdoing it a little, and then use reverb to then place it in the room. So we went over a lot of stuff. I hope this was helpful. These are more advanced concepts, and again, sometimes it's hard to hear through the speakers. So hopefully you have headphones or can listen to these in a good listening environment to hear more of the effects that it's having. But we are trying to talk more about realistic orchestra sounds, and I know that particularly if you're producing trailer music, which I do as well, and more epic music, a lot of these rules kind of get thrown out, because in that world, we're just trying to make it sound as awesome as possible. So, and I know that. And so you might use parts of what we're talking about here, and but other parts would be like, well, I know that's the way it should sound in an orchestra, but I don't like the way that's sounding because it doesn't have the impact. And I get it. And so, in the world of epic music nowadays, and more modern music and more hybrid, and like I said, trailer music, a lot of this stuff of this more traditional, realistic sound isn't always followed, I guess I will say, because in that world, we're just trying to make it sound amazing, and it doesn't matter if it's right. But anyway, it's good to know these concepts. It's just, I think it's helpful if you're starting out to really understand the different layers of the orchestra, the different places where they sit on the stage, the effect of having them further away from the audience or closer to the audience, and how that translates into your mix, because at the end of the day, you will also be mixing this stuff. And if you have more tools to control the depth, whether it's the volume or whether you're using EQ or reverb, you have these different tools to kind of control what comes into focus and what gets pushed back, right? That is really powerful, and that's kind of the main theme of all this. So I hope that was helpful. Please, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. We're trying to get this channel out to more folks, and if every like you make helps make this more available to the other folks looking for this information, because that's how the YouTube algorithm works. And I'll see you next time.